What if I told you the missile attack you might have scrolled past this week was actually the 5th time this exact same war has almost restarted from scratch? Stick around, because the real story is stranger and scarier than the headline. Before we go further, if this kind of breakdown helps you actually understand what's happening in the world instead of just reacting to scary headlines, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like, and send this to one person who keeps asking you, wait, is America at war with Iran or not? Because honestly, even the news can't keep up with this one. Let's fix that together. Here's the situation in one sentence. Iran fired missiles at American forces. Every single one got shot down. And within hours, the United States hit back with a wave of strikes so wide that American officials themselves called it a powerful response. That's the headline. But headlines never tell you why something happened or what it means for tomorrow. So let's slow down and actually walk through this properly. This didn't come out of nowhere. To understand why a handful of missiles fired one night in late July triggered such a massive American response, you need to understand what's been happening since the end of February this year. That's when the United States and Israel launched a joint operation against Iran, an operation so large that American commanders called it the biggest concentration of military power the region had seen in a generation. Within days, Iran's supreme leader was killed. Think about that for a second. Not a general, not a commander. The single most powerful man in the entire Iranian government, gone in the opening days of the war. His son was eventually named as his successor, but the shock of losing the top of the chain of command that fast sent ripples through the whole regime. From that moment on, this stopped being a short, sharp conflict and turned into something else entirely. A long, grinding, on-again, off-again war that has now dragged on for 5 months. And here's the part that makes this whole story so exhausting to follow. There have already been multiple ceasefires, one in April, another attempt in the summer. Each time, diplomats and mediators worked to bring both sides back from the edge. Each time, the fighting eventually started again anyway. At one point, the United States even said publicly that the ceasefire was over. Then a pause. Then strikes again. It's been that kind of year. So when you hear that Iran fired missiles again this week, you're not looking at some brand new crisis. You're looking at the latest chapter of a cycle that has already repeated itself several times. And once you understand the pattern, this most recent flare-up starts to make a lot more sense. Here's what actually happened. Iran fired missiles toward American forces in the region. American defense systems detected them, tracked them, and shot every single one down before they could reach their target. Nobody was hurt. Nothing was destroyed. On paper, it looks like a complete failure for Iran. But President Trump didn't treat it like a minor footnote. Standing in front of reporters, he said the incoming fire had been knocked down completely, and then he made it clear that the United States wasn't just going to let this slide. In his words, they took a shot, so now it's America's turn. That phrase, our turn, tells you everything about how this war actually works. It's not really about body counts or damaged buildings in any single moment. It's about proving that every attack gets answered. That's the entire logic holding this conflict together. Attack, response, pause, attack again. A rhythm that's repeated itself over and over since February. And the response this time was not small. American Central Command announced what they called a heavy wave of strikes against dozens of targets belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. We're talking about military command centers, missile and drone production sites, coastal surveillance posts, and facilities tied to Iran's naval capabilities. This wasn't a symbolic slap. This was a broad, deliberate message aimed at Iran's ability to keep fighting at all. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting, because Iran's missile launch wasn't the only thing happening that week. Just before the missile attack, Iran had also been striking American allies across the region. There were reports of an attack that killed a worker in Kuwait. A drone strike hit a tanker owned by an American company near an Egyptian port. Bases in Bahrain reportedly took hits aimed at radar systems and communication equipment. This wasn't one isolated missile launch sitting alone in a news cycle. It was one visible spike inside a much wider, messier wave of attacks spreading across multiple countries at once. And that's really the story people miss when they only catch the headline. This war isn't happening in one place. It's happening in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Jordan, near Egyptian waters, inside Iraq, and of course inside Iran itself. 6 or 7 countries, all tangled into the same conflict, all absorbing hits meant for someone else. Which brings us to maybe the most surprising development in this entire chapter. Saudi Arabia joined the fight. For most of this war, Saudi Arabia has stayed on the sidelines when it comes to offensive action. They've absorbed attacks, they've watched missiles cross their airspace, but they've mostly avoided striking back directly, choosing instead to focus on defense and stay out of the active combat side of things. That changed this week. American and Saudi fighter jets carried out a joint strike against Iran-backed militia positions inside Iraq, hitting logistics sites and weapons depots. Reports say at least 20 fighters were killed and more than 30 others wounded. The Saudi Defense Ministry released a statement afterward that struck a very careful tone, saying they don't want to escalate this conflict further, but they will respond to any aggression aimed at them. Read that sentence again because it matters more than it sounds. That's not a country jumping into a war with excitement. That's a country saying, quietly and firmly, we tried to stay out of this, and we can't anymore. When a nation that has spent 5 months absorbing hits without hitting back finally decides to join an offensive operation, that tells you something about how much pressure has been building underneath the surface. If you're finding this useful, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because we're only about halfway through unpacking what this all actually means, and the second half explains why this keeps happening in the first place. Now let's talk about Iraq for a second, because their position in all of this is genuinely uncomfortable. The strike against those militia targets happened on Iraqi soil. Iraq didn't ask for it, and Iraq's government has repeatedly objected whenever foreign strikes land inside their borders. But here's their problem. Iran-backed militia groups operate freely across large parts of Iraq, sometimes with more real influence on the ground than Iraq's own government has. So every time American or allied forces strike a target tied to Iran inside Iraq, Baghdad ends up in an impossible spot. They can condemn the strike to protect their own credibility, or they can stay quiet and look like they're simply letting other countries treat their land as a battlefield. Neither option is good. And this has been Iraq's reality through this entire war, caught in the middle of a fight they didn't start and genuinely cannot control. Let's step back even further and talk about why Iran keeps choosing this specific strategy, because it's not random and it's not desperation. It's calculated. Drones are cheap, really cheap, especially compared to what it costs to shoot one down. A single interceptor missile used to destroy an incoming drone can cost many times more than the drone itself. So even when every single drone gets intercepted, and even when every single missile gets shot down like it did this week, Iran still comes out ahead in one specific way. They force the other side to spend enormous amounts of money, resources, and attention just to stay safe. It's not about winning a single battle. It's about wearing down the other side's patience, budget, and readiness through constant, repeated pressure. Military analysts call this asymmetric warfare, and it's been the backbone of Iran's entire approach since this war started back in February. But here's the thing that makes this strategy look shakier the longer this war drags on. Every major attempt Iran has launched at American forces directly has failed to land. The missiles this week, all intercepted. Attacks reported throughout the war have repeatedly been stopped by American and allied air defense systems working together in real time. That's an incredibly difficult technical achievement, by the way. A ballistic missile in its final stretch toward a target can be moving many times faster than sound. Defenders have only seconds to detect it, calculate its path, and launch something fast enough and accurate enough to physically intercept it in midair. Doing that once is impressive. Doing it consistently, attack after attack, month after month, says a lot about how seriously American forces have been preparing for exactly this kind of scenario. So here's a real question worth sitting with. If none of these attacks are actually succeeding in any meaningful military sense, why does Iran keep doing this? There are really two possible answers, and honestly, the truth is probably some mix of both. One possibility is that Iran genuinely believes that enough sustained pressure, spread out over enough time, will eventually wear down American resolve or destabilize the region enough to force a deal on Iran's terms. The other possibility is something a little different, that these attacks aren't really about winning anymore. They're about proving to their own people and to the rest of the region that Iran hasn't been broken. That even after losing their supreme leader in the opening days of this war, even after 5 months of being on the losing end of nearly every direct exchange, they're still capable of striking back. Still relevant, still standing. Neither explanation should make you feel comfortable, by the way. A country willing to keep attempting missile strikes against a much stronger military, even when those strikes keep failing, still has real capability and real intent. That's not a country that's given up. That's a country that's still calculating its next move. Now let's talk about why this particular week's escalation matters beyond just the missiles and the strikes, because there's a financial and human ripple effect that stretches way beyond the battlefield itself. Every time this conflict flares up, oil markets react almost instantly. When fighting paused briefly at the end of July, oil prices actually dropped sharply, one of the biggest single-day declines in months, because traders finally saw a moment of reduced risk. But that relief is always temporary. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil routes on the planet, has been running at a tiny fraction of its normal traffic for most of this year. Before the war, around 100 commercial ships passed through that strait on a typical day. During the worst stretches of fighting, that number has dropped down into the single digits. That's not a small disruption. That's a fundamental reshaping of how global energy moves, and it's happening in real time, tied directly to whether Iran and the United States are shooting at each other on any given week. And it's not just oil tankers and military bases feeling this. Regular people are caught in the middle too. A worker killed in Kuwait, civilians injured in strikes that spilled into Jordan, fighters and militia members killed in Iraq. Every one of those is a real person, not a statistic on a slide. This war has already produced real casualties across multiple countries that never asked to be part of it, and that number keeps climbing every time this cycle repeats. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about actually understanding this stuff instead of just skimming a headline and moving on. So let's keep going, because there's still one more piece of this puzzle that ties everything together, and it explains why this war refuses to actually end. This entire conflict has now survived multiple ceasefires. Think about how unusual that actually is. A ceasefire agreement gets signed, both sides step back, and then within weeks, sometimes days, something happens that breaks it apart again. An attack, a disputed claim, a dispute over control of a key waterway, and the fighting resumes almost like the ceasefire never happened at all. This has already occurred more than once this year. Iran and the United States agreed to a pause. Fighting stopped. Then it started again. They agreed to another arrangement. That one collapsed too. As of this very week, officials on the Iranian side have publicly stated that what currently exists cannot even be honestly described as a ceasefire, while American officials have said they're ready to resume strikes if a real lasting agreement isn't reached. That tells you something important. This isn't a war that's spiraling toward peace. It's a war that keeps finding brief moments of exhaustion, mistaking them for resolution, and then getting pulled right back into fighting the moment new pressure builds up again. And each time that cycle repeats, it seems to involve more countries, more territory, and more risk than the time before. Saudi Arabia joining offensive strikes for the first time this week is a perfect example of that pattern expanding outward instead of shrinking. So where does that leave things right now? At this exact moment you're watching this, Iran fired missiles that failed completely. The United States responded with a wide, deliberate wave of strikes across dozens of targets. Saudi Arabia broke months of restraint to join an offensive operation for the first time. Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt's coastline, and Iraq all absorbed pieces of this same widening conflict within the space of just a few days. And underneath all of it, a so-called ceasefire that both sides can't even agree still technically exists. This is a war that has already proven over and over that it doesn't end quietly. It pauses, it simmers, and then something, a missile, a drone, a disputed claim, sets the entire cycle back into motion again. Nothing about this most recent flare-up suggests that pattern is about to change anytime soon. If anything, the involvement of new countries like Saudi Arabia in direct offensive action suggests the opposite, that the circle of countries willing to get pulled into this fight is getting wider, not smaller. Here's what I want you to actually take away from all of this. It's easy to see one missile attack, one retaliatory strike, and treat it like an isolated event, a single news story that comes and goes. But when you step back and look at the full pattern, 5 months of fighting, multiple broken ceasefires, a supreme leader killed in the opening days, an entire country like Saudi Arabia shifting its position after months of restraint, you start to see something much bigger than a single headline. You start to see a region that has been reshaped week by week, strike by strike, into something genuinely different from what it looked like at the start of this year. So here's the real question worth sitting with after everything we just covered. Do you think this specific round of strikes finally forces a real pause, one that actually holds this time? Or do you think, based on everything this war has already shown us, that we'll be right back here again within a matter of weeks, watching the exact same cycle play out one more time. Drop your honest take in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of story where hearing what other people think actually adds something real to the conversation. And if this video helped you finally make sense of what's actually happening over there, instead of just reacting to another scary headline, that's genuinely the entire reason I make these. So do me one last favor. Like this video if you learned something, subscribe if you want to keep understanding stories like this as they unfold, and share this with someone who's been just as confused by all of this as you probably were 5 minutes ago. Because the truth is, this story isn't over, not even close. And whenever the next chapter begins, and based on everything we just walked through, it will begin, you're going to want to already understand exactly how we got here.